Today we're taking a look at two really popular lenses from Sigma, and one of them is the 28-45, which is their newest lens made for both L-mount cameras and E-mount cameras. We're specifically looking at the L-mount version as we're using it with the Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K full frame. We're comparing it against the Sigma 18-35. Now this is a staple for videographers, wedding filmmakers, pretty much anyone who needed a really good general purpose zoom that had a wide aperture at f1.8, making a lot of cameras that weren't necessarily great in low light, definitely performing way better. So we're going to take a look at the 28-45, as I said, on the Blackmagic full frame 6K, and we're actually going to use the Sigma 18-35 on the red Komodo. The 18-35 is meant for Super 35 cameras, where the 28-45 is meant for full frame, and it is the spiritual successor of the 18-35. A lot of people have been asking for years, can you make this 18-35 in a full frame version? Because there really hasn't. The only thing that was close to it was the 24-35 f2, and that was for full frame cameras. It was very similar to this, but not exactly the same. There is a difference between f2 and f1.8, although it's not that much of a difference. This lens definitely fills that bucket. I also want to give a quick shout out to B&H, as they actually sent me this lens on loan so I could make these videos. So I do want to say thank you, B&H, and appreciate sending out this loaner, as it makes these videos possible. So if you're interested in this lens after the review, definitely check out the links below, check out B&H, and you can get it pretty much now. This is available in L mount and in E mount, and there's actually one big difference between the L and the E mount that I'll get to later in the video. I use Cinematch to match the Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K to the red Komodo in the settings I was using on the red Komodo. Now, this first batch of footage I took here in the studio, and what I did was compare the similar focal lengths to each other. I compared 18 on the Sigma 18-35 at 1.8 to 28 on the 28-45 at 1.8. And so here I have the footage from the red Komodo. You can see it's a little bit wider. Also, the Komodo is a little bit wider than traditional Super 35 sensors. It's actually got a 1.33 crop of full frame. And we're shooting both cameras at 6K DCI. So you're getting full frame on the actual Blackmagic 6K full frame. And then we're getting, Super 35 technically on the red Komodo. The cool part about the Sigma 18-35 and this 28-45 is the fact that for the most part all the way through, this lens is really sharp. Now I don't have necessarily charts to test how soft they are compared to the other ones, so we are looking at this over YouTube, so take it for what you will. But as you go through the range of all the different focal lengths, the one big takeaway is just like the 18-35, at all focal lengths, at all f-stops, you are getting a professional, sharp-looking image out of the 28-45, which is why I see a lot of professionals picking this up for their E-mount or L-mount cameras. It's just a really good all-in-one lens. I would say the only downside is you don't really get too wide, and you don't really get that telephoto. So you're gonna have to be okay if you wanna get a super shallow depth of field, getting closer to your subject, even at 45. Next, I took both of these lenses outside. I did them both at their widest focal length and their most telephoto focal length, because it was really hot outside. I was getting some help filming myself. And on top of that, I wanted to get it in a non-controlled setting, because obviously you could say it's easy to get both lenses to look great in a controlled setting here in the home studio. So the only variables I do want to mention is I'm using the same brand ND filter on both of these lenses. However, on the 18-35, since I'm using it on the red Komodo, I am using an IR cut UV filter. Reason being is the red Komodo does have a problem with IR pollution if you don't use an IR cut filter. And a lot of the older Blackmagics had that problem as well. But what's interesting, and it doesn't really get spoken about enough, and I'll cover this more in detail in a future video, but it seems that the Blackmagic full frame 6K has some kind of either IR cut built into the filter that's in front of the sensor, or maybe they built it into the sensor. I don't really know, and that's why I don't want to necessarily go too far in the weeds on it in this video, but I can use this ND filter on this lens, And I'm wearing a black shirt in these images. You can clearly tell the shirt is black and it's not shifting to magenta. That's the biggest tell when you have a lot of IR pollution in your lens, camera, ND filter. It's just a lot of blacks easily show up, magenta, greens get shifted. So it's really cool to see that the Blackmagic actually fixed this in the full frame 6K. Now looking at the images outside, they are really close. Of course, the focal lengths don't match exactly, but if you're trying to get a lens that is really close to the 18 to 35 but full frame, this 28 to 45 really just keeps proving itself. Now let's talk about some of the differences between these lenses, because there are quite a few. Even though this is the spiritual successor to the 18 to 35, it's actually improved on a lot of things from the 18 to 35, but there's also some downsides that I think a select group of people who are interested in this lens will care about. And I think there's also a much bigger group that probably won't care, but it is worth noting. So the first thing is the L-mount version of this lens is a linear based focus. So what does that mean? That means that no matter how you focus, it's going to focus at the speed that you pull it. So if you go fast, it's going to go fast. If you go slow, it's going to stay slow. It's always going to be consistent how you're pulling it. Where the Sony E-mount version, if you focus faster, it's actually going to cycle through the focus a lot faster. If you cycle slower, it's going to cycle a lot slower. Why is that a problem? If you're adding a follow focus to this lens, a wireless follow focus 2, and you're trying to pull focus, it makes pulling focus on the Sony versions a lot more unreliable, where a lot of people who pick up this lens are probably going to be using it with cameras like the Blackmagic 6K full frame, or maybe even some L-mount cameras that just don't have good autofocus, and they're going to be using follow focusing with them, or they're going to be just manually focusing. It is much better to have a linear focus system on this lens when you're doing manual focus based work, or again, using a follow focus. When using this lens with a gimbal like the RS2, 3, or 4, it being a linear focusing lens also helps with the focus pull when you're, using the dial ring here on the front of the RS2 and you're trying to pull focus really easily. I was able to pull focus really easily with this lens, just as easy as I could with the 18 to 35. And so that's a really big deal about having linear focusing, especially if you're doing a lot of gimbal work and you're a solo operator. It'll make things a lot easier for you, especially in the field if you're doing a lot of run and gun. So it made me happy that the L-mount version of this does the linear focusing. The autofocus actually does work really great on this lens. So if you're a Sony user, you're not really going to see a problem with it. I think a lot of the Sony users are going to be using autofocus anyways with this lens. And then even on the Blackmagic 6K full frame, it doesn't have continuous autofocus, but it has touch autofocus, where it'll autofocus just one time to where you touch it, or you have the point and you hit the button on the back of the camera. The autofocus works pretty quick even on that camera. So if you're using it with some of the newer Lumix cameras, I can see you getting a really great autofocus experience on this, where the autofocus isn't terrible on the 18 to 35, but it's definitely not up to pace with the more modern mirrorless cameras. On top of that, the autofocus is pretty loud on the 18 to 35, where it is not that loud at all. It's almost near silent on this 28 to 45. You can't really hear it, where you can totally hear this thing is focusing through. There were some shots I did with the Red Komodo where it was even hunting. Now, the Red Komodo doesn't have a great autofocus system, so I'm not going to take points off of this lens for the Komodo not autofocusing, as I've put this on cameras like my FX30 with the MC11 adapter, and it's autofocused really well. I want to talk about a few misconceptions of this 28 to 45, because although, yes, it is definitely a big lens, people weren't really talking about the 18 to 35 being a huge lens, although no one said it was a small lens. So I wanted to put both of these together so you can see that, up close, the 28 to 45 is very similar in size to the 18 to 35 when using an adapter. This is the Canon EF to RF adapter. There's also the Sigma MC21, MC11 for Sony's that are pretty much the same size. And so with an adapter, they're very similar. I would say the 28 to 45 is just slightly chunkier, but you can't really tell that much when you put them both side by side. But when you see them in person, you could see there is a slight difference. But I wouldn't say this lens is huge. It's just not as small as a lot of the other lenses you can get for full frame that are primes. Maybe not f1.8, maybe like f2, f2.8. But this is also almost a variable prime lens where you're getting multiple focal lengths, and all the focal lengths give you a professional image out of this lens. That's a really cool thing about these Sigma lenses, whether it's the 28 to 45 or the 18 to 35 that filmmakers have been using for years. You can use them for stuff like content creation, but you can use them in high-end professional productions. I mean, they use the 18 to 35 not as the main lens, but as one of the lenses in movies like Guardians of the Galaxy 2. I would say that's part of the reason that a lot of people gravitate towards this 18 to 35, because no matter what focal length you're at, you're getting a professional image. It's really sharp, looks really great. Some people say it looks too sharp, but the beauty of that is a lot of filmmakers use black pro mist filters. I think a lot of filmmakers will probably use black pro mist filters even on the 28 to 45, as this is very sharp. Now on the 18 to 35, you do actually have a physical reading right here that shows you where you are on your focus plane. And technically you can even focus this lens without having power attached to it, because, you know, while you're focusing, you can just focus through it. And even though I believe the 18 to 35 is some kind of focus by wire, especially because you can just keep focusing past the endpoint on either side, whether you go to infinity or minimum focus, you can see where you are physically on the lens at all times, which was always a really cool feature that I like. You pretty much don't get that on any of the new mirrorless lenses, and this is no exception. You don't have a dial on here that shows you where you are on the focus plane. There's also some extra buttons on this lens that if you're a Blackmagic user, you're not going to be able to utilize. If you're a Lumix user, or you're using Sony cameras and you have the Sony version of this lens, you'll have extra customizable buttons on this, which don't exist on the 18 to 35. Now, as you can see right here, this lens actually has a physical aperture ring where you can change your f-stop on the lens. There's also a lock right here, so if you want to just leave it on A, which is automatic, you can then change it in your camera and not worry about moving this into one of the other apertures, because if you do, it's going to override what the camera has. So you can do from 1.8 to f16, and you can choose on the lens itself. There's also a dial right here. I'll show you where you can actually make it to where it clicks as you're cycling through the different apertures. It's cool to have if you want to have that kind of feel. If you just want it to be nice and smooth, maybe you're trying to actually pull the aperture going in from different lighting scenarios, you can turn that off and it will give you a nice, smooth, clickless aperture pull. Now, I didn't do a first impressions on the 28 to 45, and this video, I guess in some ways, serves as that, comparing it against the 18 to 35. I'll be doing a full review on this lens, so make sure you stay tuned to see that review. But my overall thoughts when comparing the 28 to 45 against the 18 to 35, although using different cameras, is the 28 to 45 in a lot of ways is what the 18 to 35 was on Super 35 cameras. You get a very professional lens that gives you professional image quality at all apertures, and it's reliable, so you can use it for any professional work. I see a lot of content creators using this maybe as their home studio lens and then being able to take it out and using it for other kinds of work. I would say it's a little bit more limiting than the 18 to 35 as far as on my Komodo, I feel like I get a little bit more telephoto on the 35 end just because of the inherent crop. And I get a little bit wider on the wide end. It's still not enough, but you get a little bit more range. And then, of course, there's the price difference. This 18 to 35 is like half the price of the 28 to 45. And I get it. This is a Super 35 lens. This is a full frame lens. But I bring that up because it has to do with the value. You get a lot of value out of the 18 to 35 to where it's pretty much a no-brainer for, I would say, almost everyone that does video should have one of these in their kit if they have a camera that supports this lens. Where the 28 to 45, since it's twice the price, I think it comes down to, would you use this lens all the time if you had it? If you would, I think it's 100% worth the money. If you don't see yourself using it all the time and you see it as more of a specialty lens, I would maybe rent this thing before you go out and buy it, because the 18-35 was my workhorse lens, and I still to this day use it a lot. If I only had the Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K and that was my only camera, yes, I would totally be buying the 28-45 and I would be using it all the time. But right now, in my situation, I have multiple cameras, multiple different camera systems. I've got the Komodo, the Blackmagic, the FX30 that we're filming on. And so for me, the 18-35 is still kind of in that primary space. The fact that this 28-45 matches the 18-35 so well, I definitely will pick it up at some point in the future. But I just know how my filmmaking business is right now. Most of the videos I'm doing are podcasting, content creation based. I'm not necessarily doing a lot of weddings or even like big filmmaking jobs right now. I've pretty much filled all of the outstanding jobs I've had earlier this year. So I just don't see myself using this lens quite all the time, but it's a fantastic lens. And I think when I do have the funds coming in, I'll pick one up so I could use the Komodo and the Blackmagic, and they match. The other thing that I'm kind of hoping is that Sigma comes out with a version of the 50-100, because the 18-35 and the 50-100 have kind of been my staple lenses for documentary filmmaking and narrative on the red Komodo. They just work really well together. The image quality is really similar. They cover a lot of different focal lengths. And although I could probably get away with not having some wider end focal lengths with a lens like this, it doesn't make up for the more telephoto focal lengths that you definitely need, especially if you're going to go more run and gun or film events, weddings, whatever it may be. So it would be interesting to see if Sigma comes out with some kind of answer to their 50-100 that maybe is better than what the 50-100 was, because there were a lot of problems with it too. I mean, the 18-35 and the 28-45, they have minimal focus breathing. I'm not going to say that there's like zero focus breathing, because there's a little bit, but compared to a lot of other lenses, this is very minimal. So I do really enjoy this lens. I just wanted to give you my honest, unfiltered opinion, and I do want to thank B&H again for sending this lens out on loan, because without that, I don't know if I could provide a really unbiased opinion. So thank you to B&H again, because it helps me put out content like this. If you're interested in picking up this lens, make sure to check out the links below. If you have any questions, I did mention I have a video upcoming with this lens for a review. I'm also going to test it against the 50mm f2 contemporary lens from Sigma, because that has been glued to my Blackmagic just because of how small it is and the image quality is really great. So I want to see at 45mm, how does this compare? Is it a lot better than that lens? And we'll find out together in that video. So make sure to stay tuned, hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell if you got value out of today's video. And until next time, my name's Jeff Fagien. Thank you for watching as always, and I will catch you in the next video.